Welcome to the Education Corner, a podcast by Education Choices magazine.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our Education Corner podcast and to be able to speak to you, Mr. Nick Hewlett, the head at St Dunstan's College. The college, for those listening, was established in 1888 in Lewisham and runs from nursery through to sixth form. To start our questions today, Nick, please do explain to us the importance and relevance of the college motto, Albam Exorna.
Yeah, I feel really privileged to have that as our motto, Albam Exorna. It translates as adorn the white, and it's really very unusual and speaks to a very ambitious and forward-thinking foundation back in the late 19th century. So adorn the white is to do with the fact that we have a blank shield, a completely white shield, with just one corner of it filled in with the St Dunstan standing there proudly, but the rest of it is a complete blank canvas. And the reason for that was the founders here at St Dunstan's felt very strongly that education ought to be about allowing young people to find their own way, to trailblaze their own journey through school, to be true to who they are, to be individuals and to be content with the individuality that personified them. And we think that's a really wonderful and radical thing of its time that's just as relevant today as it was back then. So the whole kind of principle around the school is that when you join us here at St Dunstan's, we give you this blank canvas. We give you a huge array of different opportunities, and through that breadth of opportunity, you're able to chart your own course, be true to who you are, and to discover your true identity. And I suppose supporting and scaffolding all of that is having a really open-minded liberal culture and a diverse school community. All of that helps speak to that founding motto that underpins everything that we do.
That sounds absolutely amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about the ethos and values at St Dunstan's College?
It continues in the same theme, really, from the Albam Exorna, because that motto is central to the ethos that we have going on here. We are a very diverse school. We're in an incredibly diverse part of southeast London. We have a very multicultural, multiracial, diverse socioeconomic intake of students. And with that comes a real vibrancy of difference and a celebration of difference and a celebration of individuality that runs to the core of our identity as an institution. We are a community of all faiths and none, and we're a community who cherishes that diversity and cherishes that individuality. And so I suppose at its heart, we are a very liberal school. We are not forged from the conservative mould of independent education that I think does follow some of the other schools in this country in that sector. We are very much a school that ensures that young people can be comfortable with who they are. And there are lots of ways in which we reflect that. And also a school that is true to that initial ambition in 1888, where we were a school that was radical for its day. So we were founded as one of the first schools in the country to challenge the very conservative traditional curriculum that was rooted all around literature, religion, the classics. And we were one of the first schools in the country, if not the world, to introduce science and technology. So we had science and technology rooms where none of the other schools were doing it. And it was an incredibly radical concept for its time. And associated with that, another sort of element of our radical history, the incoming head and the governing body who appointed him was very keen on this idea of heuristic education, hands-on education. He once said, it's not so much what a child knows that's important, it's how he finds out what he knows. And actually that's an incredibly radical concept for its time, and it was all very didactic teaching. So the reason I tell you that is because the ethos here and the values here are around challenging some of those educational norms of today. So just to give you a few examples of the things that we do, we have a co-curricular program that's embedded into the timetable of the school. It's not a sort of add-on, it's actually timetabled, registered, monitored. The whole program is structured around the values of the organisation. So young people have to sign up to a whole range of different values through that strand of their education. We have a talk period here called the Stewart program, which is all around life skills and developing the broader sense of self. So we teach there around kind of issues to do with toxic masculinity, toxic femininity. We teach them about resilience, conflict, deconfliction, and other important practical life skills. We have a huge emphasis on the creative arts here. We think creativity is really being starved from the education sector in this country, and we have an enormous emphasis on it, concluding with a 2-week festival where we're off timetable for the last 2 weeks of the year, and we just undertake creative activity for the sake of it. We have a really important adventurous activity program here that speaks to our value of courage and confidence, because we want young people not to be arrogant, but to be assured with who they are and have the confidence to take on the vagaries of society as they leave from this school. So I suppose in summary, the overarching ethos of the school is one of a values-driven education, a broad education that allows young people through an open-minded and liberal context to be themselves and to celebrate the diversity of which they're a part.
Just off the back of that, obviously you do welcome students from many different socioeconomic backgrounds, and obviously it's a very diverse culture. What's your bursary provision like?
So we have an extensive bursary programme. It's only right that we do. We live in an area of London where there is huge need financially, and we don't want to be that school on the hill with the gate shut. That is absolutely not what we want whatsoever. So we do a lot of outreach work and partnership work. I'm sure we'll come back to that later, but associated with that, of course, is also wanting children to be able to come to this school who would otherwise not have the means to do so. So at the moment, we give a significant amount of money every year to facilitating those families to be able to access this education, and it's a sort of fundamental extension of that ethos and values that I spoke about earlier.
You talk about the St Dunstan's difference. I like it, it's alliterative. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are really different as an independent school. And the reason we won Independent School of the Year last year was on the basis of challenging the sector, asking difficult questions of the sector and being different. There are lots of ways by which we are different, I think, but I suppose the biggest one of those would be a genuine belief that the sector has become too conservative and that it needs to modernise and it needs to be fit for purpose for 2022 Britain. And in order to do that, it needs to showcase that actually there is a place for private education, that it's perfectly acceptable for hardworking parents to decide to spend their money sending their children to independent schools, but equally that it needs to be palatable for society. And in terms of being palatable, it needs to be an environment that's connected, that's rooted into the community for which these institutions are a part and for which they should serve. And we have to do everything in our power to stop these independent schools coming across as bastions of privilege, and actually to make sure that our independent schools are deeply connected with the roots of the communities where they were founded. So the community partnership work that's intrinsic to our very ethos and DNA here at St Dunstan's, in my view, needs to be replicated across these other schools. And equally, the culture inside the school also needs to be modernised, I would say, across the sector. This idea of having a very sort of monochrome staff, in particular, schools that haven't really embraced the EDI in its fullest context. I think those schools have a long way to go to become palatable to the broader societal narrative. I also, frankly, believe that the days of a sort of conveyor belt independent school education, where you take children into your independent school aged 11 and churn them out aged 18, all looking the same, sounding the same and acting the same, I think those days are gone. We see it in government, and we don't want that anymore. We want youngsters to go through the independent education system coming out as who they are, to be okay with that, and to be individuals going into a globalized and multicultural workforce. So I really do think that as a sector, we need to be challenging ourselves, challenging our own historic conservative thinking, and modernising and developing in some of the ways that I've described.
And as a magazine, obviously diversity, equality and inclusion are our main focus. What challenges have you faced as the head of a leading co-ed school so far?
Well, it's been a great adventure, to be honest. I started here 9 years ago and there was a lot of work to be done. I mean, it was a school that was great in many ways, that had lots going for it, particularly, I would say, its location, but it had lost its way a little and it needed to refound its identity here in southeast London. And that was a task, and a challenging task. Those first few years needed a lot of change. It needed to really sort of land on a clarity of identity that perhaps was lacking. So that was a real challenge. Coming out the other side of that, of course, we then went into COVID, and that's been really, really difficult. For us, it was doubly difficult because we signed a £25 million estate project just as we were hearing about this virus in China. So we'd signed up to this enormous development project, buildings project here on site, a new STEM block, new sixth form centre, new junior school, new performing arts centre, new theatre, the whole lot. We really went for it. And there was risk associated with that. And so when the pandemic came, we had to stick to the building schedule. So we had the challenge of the logistics of an enormous site build, the challenges of the pandemic, the challenges of the financials, the challenges of the unknown. And actually, navigating the ship through that was really difficult. We took, with hindsight, some fantastic early decisions around remote learning. We were one of the first schools in the area to just, before the lockdown started, to shut the whole school and train everybody in what was then not really very well known, Teams. No one had really heard of that at that point. We trained absolutely everybody. So we were able to do 100% remote learning from the very beginning, from the off. And that was a really good decision. And actually, in the end, our approach and how we managed to get through the pandemic worked to our favour, and the success just continued to come our way. But I would say that's really difficult. And the aftermath of the pandemic's equally got its own challenges too.
Exactly. I think now working online and working from home are now part of the furniture, aren't they, to all of us? It was recently celebrated that you shared with your students and parents that you were in a same-sex marriage. And I wanted to ask what led to this decision, and how do you feel it's benefited or changed the culture of the school, perhaps?
Well, the decision really came about from a realisation, and you might ask why I had this realisation so late, but it became obvious to me just how beneficial role models are to young people. And I began to see it, particularly as we were doing sort of surveys around our racial diversity in particular, and the issue that lots of us share around that, not having enough role models, racially diverse and multicultural school. And I thought, well, there is one area that I can help in, because, I can just be really honest about who I am. And assisting youngsters from the LGBTQ plus community who might be struggling with their own identity, and actually being able to say to them, look, it's absolutely okay. It's okay to be who you are, and to offer them that position of being a role model in that particular area is something that was free for me to give, and I felt would give tremendous benefits to the youngsters. I have to say that the predominant reaction from most young people was one of, well, why that's fine. I mean, who cares? Frankly, they couldn't care less, I think, really. But that's not quite true. There were lots of lovely messages and emails I received as well from young people who were very grateful. But predominantly, there was a sense amongst this generation of thinking, well, why is that news? They certainly couldn't understand why it made it to the third page of the Times. They just didn't get that at all, why this would be big news. So it was really, for me, about role modelling. I think, going back to my earlier point, the sector is very conservative. It does lack diversity. It is a problem. I would say it is a problem for the independent education sector that we have a predominance of white. Well, we certainly used to have a predominance of white heterosexual men. That has changed, developed, and got a lot better, in particular with far more women coming into HMC schools, which is an absolute breath of fresh air, I have to say. So that is improving, but there is still a very, very long way to go when we can say that our leaders in independent education reflect the children and the families that they serve. That's why it came about, and that's why I did what I did.
I thought it was brilliant. Can you explain the broad Renaissance education that St Dunstan's College provides?
My schooling, the school I went to, which is well known, is very different now. But when I was there in the 90s, the definition of success was very narrow. In particular, I think about my sporting career or non-career, where I wasn't very good at rugby. I knew that when I was 11 years old. But if you weren't very good at rugby, that was you done for, really, in that kind of school culture. And I felt really hard done by that, and felt later in life that actually, with a real Renaissance approach to the co-curricular programme and a real breadth of opportunity, it would have done me enormous good to have had a much healthier relationship with sport. And so that's just one example of why I felt very strongly that we ought to have a really broad gender-neutral approach to how we define excellence and achievement in sport and co-curricular and in the curriculum. I also always been very ill at ease with this idea that we narrow down the academic subjects for children as a lever to try and engineer a few more percentage points in a league table. I think that's totally wrong. And I think schools that are starting now to drop the creative arts at the end of year 8, at the end of year 9, or they put them on a carousel, or they don't do single subject science, or they drop classical civilization, I think we're doing an enormous disservice to these young people throughout their early adolescence. So my view has always been very strongly that throughout year 7, year 8 and year 9, so 11 to 13, 14, early adolescence, we all know from the science, incredibly formative period in these young people's lives. It's going to have tremendous impact on who they are as adults, that they ought to have a huge, broad Renaissance curriculum and co-curricular program. So we have 17 standalone subjects all the way through year 7, 8, 9, no dropping. They just have to do all of it. And it's an immersive, wonderful experience. And alongside that, we have our co-curricular program, which is 300 activities every week. And that whole program, as I said earlier, is structured around our values. So you can't just come into St Dunstan's and just play football all the time. You can't do that. You have to do something in the creative arts. You have to do something from the adventurous training program. You have to do something from the youth volunteering community service program. You have to do something on the physical ed program. So you have to do something across the broad range. And so as a school, it also ties into that kind of open-minded philosophy and liberal ethos about being an individual. One of the greatest joys that I have is going up to the Performing Arts Centre and seeing boys who play football on a Saturday morning doing ballet classes in one of their co-curricular programs, or likewise dancing and singing and dancing in the school musical, and also going out and playing sport in the evenings. And that not being a thing, and you not being compartmentalised into a certain type of kid. I think that's one of the most damaging things that we do in education, is early on in adolescence, if we get school culture wrong, young people start to think, well, I've got to conform to being like this, or I've got to conform to being like this, and I've got to make that choice. Wrong. You don't have to make that choice. You can try both, and it's absolutely fine if you create the right culture for young people. Otherwise, we get people dug into positions of identity that's totally unhealthy. Going back to your LGBT point, the last assembly that I did on this, I said to the students, it's as important to feel comfortable with who you are as it is to know that it's perfectly okay to change your mind when you're a child. It's perfectly fine to have feelings and thoughts about your identity and who you are and your sexuality, and to actually decide, you know what, that's not who I am anymore. And for that not to come with any sense of judgment from anyone else. The same applies to the curriculum, the same applies to the co-curricular programme.
You talk about St Dunstan's, and I want to say it correctly, is it diapason? Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so this is the diapason is the word for it. I set it up to bring together students representing key protected characteristics from the Equality Act who had a real keen interest in furthering our celebration of diversity and assuring a culture of equality in the school. And so what it does is that we have 5 pillars, so religion and belief, sexual identity, sex and gender, disability, and each of those leads have a staff lead as well alongside them. So it's staff and children working together to develop an action plan for how we can improve our celebration of diversity and assurance of culture of equality. And what that does is it puts the decision-making back in the hands of the children. So I was getting kind of fed up with this idea of the outraged young and the outraged older generation, and never the twain shall meet. So I deliberately wanted to crack that by putting them all in a room together and saying, okay, we got to own this together as one community. So what are we going to do? We all believe in diversity. We all believe in equality. So actually, how are we going to move this forward together from your perspective, from our perspective, from teachers' perspective? And it's been amazing. It's been absolutely incredible, the ideas they've come up with, the changes that they've made.
Can you give me an example of any, like one that stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of work around teaching of race discrimination, language around race, and how we educate teachers in how to handle that better. A lot of work in quick wins in the curriculum. For example, I hadn't even thought, this came from the students, that the little junior school children having colouring pencils of different shades to shade in people. It hadn't even occurred to us that that was actually just obviously a really important thing. So we introduced that for the junior school children. We've got a multi-faith prayer room that we didn't have before. There's a whole approach to a partnership that we have with the local special educational needs school, who are helping us in terms of our accessibility and inclusion policy, and we're helping them. So there's so much stuff that's been born out of it.
What do you feel would be the challenges? I think you've touched on this quite a bit. Is there something that stands out for independent schools going into 2022 and beyond?
Societal relevance is the big one for me, and ensuring that we don't become obsolete or become dug in to a trench of identity that doesn't really resonate with broader society. I think that's a huge risk for the independent education sector. And then we also, of course, have the post-pandemic challenges that all schools have in terms of helping young people adjust back to where we are today, and the very real challenges in the world at large, and how we help young people in particular feel at ease with that and with the ease of themselves. But I suppose my biggest one would be about culture and modernising culture in schools so that it's truly inclusive and diverse.
And my final question, I know that St Dunstan's College work very hard with local schools in the community in Lewisham and possibly even beyond. Do you want to just give me a few examples of that work that you're doing with children in the local community?
So we've just been put forward for an award for our latest project, which is the Lewisham Young Leaders Academy. And we set this up in partnership with the Westside Young Leaders Academy to work with young Black boys and girls from African and Afro-Caribbean heritage who statistically are life chances, and in terms of their underperformance in Lewisham, it's a really stark contrast, and that's not right. So we put an academy on Saturday mornings where we work with those young people and charity alongside us to really correct that and to create a platform for learning and skills development that would otherwise not exist. And that's an incredible programme. We have a committee here called the WREN Committees, which is a name taken from the Spire in central London where we were originally founded. And that brings together all of our community work. And the range of things that we're doing is absolutely vast. From our facilities, of course, we're privileged to have these facilities, but really in terms of our partnerships, the work that our young people are doing with local young people and local charities to really try and enhance life opportunities for this area of Lewisham and Catford.
Thank you so much for your time. A really interesting interview. Lots of things that I'm going to be hoping to follow through with and find out more about in the magazine. We hope that we'll be able to speak to you again in the future.
No problem.